Anyway, James is a former U.S. Marine, specializing in what I guess we euphemistically call signals intelligence,
Sure.
and of course, a graduate of the uh, Korean for Signals Intelligence School. And I actually don't know how far that gets you with conversational Korean, but I assume it's pretty good.
I get a
So
I get a free donut or a free beer every once in a while, so I think all in all I can chalk it up to a success.
all right, fair enough. Fair enough. So he's the CEO of Boise, Idaho based company. Um, and it's called Shadowscape, which is a name that I was very jealous of when I first read it, and uh, and is going to be given a talk. This talk's called "Know Thyself" or "Know Thy Enemy, Know Thyself." I guess enemy first, self last. You're switching the old Sun Tzu comments
Right.
backwards. So that's that. We're going to go straight to it. I'm going to
All
turn
right.
this off.
All right. Let me jump in here. Share my screen. All right. Can you all see that?
You are good to go.
Perfect. All right. Well, appreciate you guys tuning into my talk today. Especially thank you to GRIMMCon for the opportunity to speak. The title of my talk today is "Know Thy Enemy, Know Thyself." A little bit of a switcheroo there, as was stated, which is kind of a overview of the issues of a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about, with how security is approached today, and maybe how we can utilize what we know about the adversary to apply threat-based defensive actions. So before we kick those things off, just give you a little bit of insight into my background and why I approach things the way that I do. As was mentioned, I'm a former United States Marine Corps signals intelligence analyst and Korean cryptologic linguist. Going down that road was something that I just kind of fell into and took me down this path. Was heavily focused on digital forensics, specifically mobile forensics, and as I moved forward down that road, cell phones started to get a lot more complicated, using the intelligence processes that we were utilizing to conduct forensic investigations, things like that. Cell phones started to emulate more computers, and which kind of pushed me into network forensics and network security and things like that. But I've always been kind of an intelligence nerd to the core. So during my time, once I got out of the Marines, was teaching NATO Special Forces in Belgium in intelligence-led operations. And one of the main components of what we were doing there was trying to essentially curb the IED threat, which had become very pervasive. And in doing so, we'd started to kind of adopt all source intelligence amalgamation efforts to really try to understand the adversary on a human level. And in doing so, this experience really kind of helped lead me into the way that I approach cybersecurity. I also served as digital forensics and threat intelligence instructor to governments and military all around the world, chasing bad guys. And I spent about 6-ish years at a cybersecurity firm called Route 9B, serving as their technical director of threat intelligence, helping to implement intelligence solutions there, among other things. So obviously have to obligatorily quote Sun Tzu, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So I would be remiss if I didn't go down that road. One, for the title of today's talk, but secondly, really when we break down what we're facing here, it really is a conflict just like any other. There are, there's an adversary that is using what they can understand about the environment to their advantage, and obviously we are trying to defend ourselves against those adversaries. So we're going to go through a little bit why it's so important to know oneself, and secondly, how we can do that on a security level, but secondly, how to apply these lessons to security analytics. So I think it's important to highlight a little bit why the industry fails, or at least shed some light on that. First of all, looking at the at the scattered array of corpses left behind, we have the recent Microsoft Exchange, SolarWinds, Garmin, Equifax. The list goes. It's every year, every month, every week, right? These organizations, they spend millions on security every year, yet still get attacked. So I think it's important to focus on these individual organizations, because what it highlights to me is that there's not a lack of money being thrown at the problem, right? SolarWinds is interesting, especially to me, because it illustrates kind of a breakdown or failure that was successful in most cases due to a supply chain incident. I guess we could chalk it up to is an update was pushed out that was able to serve as a dropper for subsequent attacks. But what it really illustrates to me is a subsequent cascading series of failures, right? Because getting into the network is obviously just the first the first foray into the network, and what they're really trying to accomplish is far more insidious as they move through our network. And so there are subsequent failures that need to be highlighted. One of the things that I think we need to focus on is a lack of threat-based analysis and assessment in cyber risks, even amongst security practitioners. And this has been a little bit of a theme in this conference so far, is assessment of cyber risk. So I'm going to talk on that a little bit here, but also give some ideas of how you can quantify and qualify cyber risks as you go, and in doing so, start to make meaningful communications to decision makers within our environment for what we need to prioritize in terms of our security infrastructure. Secondly, or thirdly, the cyber adversary is adaptive to new developments in the security space. It's not a static job that we've got, right? We never throw our hands up and dust our hands off and say, pat ourselves on the back because we're secure now, right? In my opinion, there's really no such thing as security. Security is just a catch-all term, right? Which really what we're trying to communicate when we say, are we secure, is we're trying to say that we have reached an acceptable level of risk, right? So we're going to be talking about what constitutes acceptable levels of risk. So we'll get into that here in a moment. And then, it was said in the keynote, as well as some other previous talks, in intelligence, decision makers are rarely the ones tasked with protecting our networks. Conversely, as security practitioners, how often are we really communicating in risk? How often are we quantifying the actual impact that's going to pertain to our network, and how we can shut that down? So when I go and I make a case that, hey, we need to implement this new security safeguard, the question is typically why, right? What am I getting out of it? And so I think part of what we need to be able to communicate is return on investment, and secondly, a cost benefit analysis, right? How much is it going to cost us to go down this road versus what are we getting out of it? All right, so the problems, security can be confusing, even for security practitioners. Even when we've got a good handle on the things that need to be done, keeping track of these things can be super daunting. It's very, very difficult to figure cyber risks without a strong knowledge of not just the adversary, but how they conduct their operations. And then secondly, it's really difficult to understand what threats you need to be concerned about without really assessing yourself. And what I think ends up being missed is a common area where people can kind of put together the information that they're gathering both internally and externally. So we'll get to that. Company owners, C-suite executives, constantly unsure if the security they're employing is adequately protecting them. Really just kind of taking on the hope strategy, saying, I hope that the folks that I've hired are, proficient enough to make sure that we're being safe. But a lot of times it's similar that they may not know what questions to be asking, right? And similarly, it's pretty common for those that are tasked with network security to not necessarily know where the quote crown jewels are, or really assess what the impacts would be. And I think we see that pretty often. And I think we're taught these principles a lot academically, but rarely are we really putting them into practice, which is unfortunate, because I think in many cases this kind of approach should be the priority. As we move forward and we implement network security controls, a lot of gaps can be left, or maybe better put, more blind spots, right? Areas that we don't even know exist. And one of the one of the main components of intelligence is really trying to understand your unknown unknowns, turn them into things that you know about. Maybe you're not sure about the threats that they pose, but at least you know that it's an issue. So as we go forward and we gather that intelligence, I think it's important to understand the difference between what we refer to as simply threat intelligence, which is always focusing on the adversary, and sometimes can be sort of a colloquial term for data, right? That is non-contextual, versus cyber intelligence, where we're really trying to understand our internal network. We're trying to understand the external adversary, and understand what pertains to what, right? And so as we do that, we start to realize and start to root out those blind spots. We've talked a lot about communication in this conference, and I think a big part of that is the empathy theme that seems to be permeating a lot of the talks, right? Trying to understand, what somebody needs to hear, right? If we're frustrated that we're not being heard as security practitioners, maybe we need to rethink how to say what we're saying, because we need to understand that a lot of the folks that are making the decisions on where to, spend security dollars and time and effort and resources are not necessarily technical, and that's not their fault. That's not necessarily their job. So, even if you're right about the issues, if you can't communicate those problems, it amounts to nothing, right? Being right is not going to get you a whole lot. And then in many cases, we're still too focused on perimeter-based security. What I see a lot of times is, people will talk about perimeter-based or defense in depth and say, yeah, we need to get away from perimeter-based security. But what I find is just several layers of perimeter, and then still kind of that soft, gooey center. And I think that's one of the issues that we really need to understand is in the last talk, or it might have been Wolf's talk, talking about phishing, right? The phishing problem where, we're so focused on making sure that the users don't click on certain things, even though that we know that they're going to. If that's really your emphasis, then that means you haven't done the legwork to prohibit malicious behavior inside your network. That's initial access, right? That's the first foothold into your network, and similarly to the SolarWinds exploit, we're still in the same stage of attack in terms of just gaining that initial foothold. But there are a cascading series of failures, but we can change that and think about these are opportunities, right, to shut down additional attack vectors. So we need to be thinking in terms of that sort of that attack framework mindset of where we have a lot of opportunities to shut things down as long as we're approaching it from that standpoint, and we'll get to more of that here in a moment. So where we can succeed, right? It's about analysis. Implement threat-based security strategies with either adversaries' tactics or risk analysis in mind. That's what I really see lacking when we are talking about a strategic approach to intelligence. Is are we really trying to understand, both ourselves, our internal safeguards, and the adversary, and make those links, right? So one of the things that we commonly talk about in our training, and things that we talk about in the military, right, is the concept of the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act process, right? Either your environment will be used against the adversary or against yourself, and more often than not, that really just comes down to who is better at understanding the environment and using those vulnerabilities against ourselves. That's something that we definitely want to shut down. We want to make sure that it's very difficult for the adversary to understand our network, because when we get down to it, understanding our adversary is just like any other conflict. There's a confluence of opportunity, right, which is the vulnerabilities and the infrastructure that we have posed to a potential adversary, and then the motive, right? The motive is one of those things that's going to be very difficult for us to get rid of. I can't really take away somebody's desire necessarily to attack my network, but I can make it more cumbersome than it's worth, right? And so on the motive side, we'll talk about some of those approaches, but on the opportunity side, are we really trying to make it so it's confusing, it's difficult to navigate, and there are more lucrative targets out there, or is it a target-rich environment, right? So when we approach it from that standpoint, we'll talk about how we can, one, get rid of some of these opportunities, but two, address the motives for an adversary, and how we can make that kind of difficult. Is our intelligence actionable? And what I mean by that is the information that we then exploit and analyze and turn into intelligence, is it something that we can actually use to inform our security strategy and better safeguard ourselves? If the answer is no, then why are you even paying attention to it? And I know that's kind of almost inflammatory, right? Well, I got to take in this threat data. Well, if it's becoming more cumbersome and it's not aiding and protecting your network, I would say don't pay attention to it, because it's not getting you anywhere. You need to be, proficient at consuming that information, turning it into something that's actionable, that you can actually posture your network defenses in a proficient way. When we go down this road, we can then take those blind spots, turn them into just known gaps, right? Areas, and we can start to almost predict likely avenues of approach for an adversary that can be used to our benefit in a number of ways. One, obviously, those are areas that I should be monitoring. These are hot spots of potential activity. But two, I can get even sort of counterintelligence, savvy with it, and approach it from the standpoint of implementing honeypots and honey creds and things like that will set off the alarms and let me know that there's something going on within my network. The nice thing about approaching it from this way is what I call top-down security, and I'll get into that here in a moment in a little bit more detail. But to give you the high-level overview, when we quantify the risk, right, by taking our threats and our vulnerabilities and assessing, the real impacts. Multiplied by impact, we get our risk, and I understand now where I really need to be focusing my effort, where I need to be prioritizing my monitoring. We start to create a few scenarios of what will likely happen. In doing so, we then need to assess our risk appetite for quantifying that risk. That's really going to be dependent upon understanding the type of impact that would be likely in a given scenario. So when we're going down that road, I can't really understand and I can't really communicate why it's important for me to implement these safeguards without effectively communicating the level of impact that would likely happen. And thus it's nearly impossible for me to assess and make a case for our risk appetite. How can you make the case that you shouldn't be focusing on a certain area when you have no idea how to quantify how impactful a scenario could be? In intelligence and security, most of the time, the decision makers are not going to be the practitioners. So make sure you're communicating those things to identify those easily solvable gaps. So kind of the overview, why is it so important to let the adversary inform our defensive? One of the things that we kind of take on is an approach that is similar to Bianco's pyramid of pain. I think most of us are pretty familiar with it, but if you're not, it really builds a strong case for why it's important to focus on behaviors over indicators of compromise, which is what many in this industry refer to, cringingly enough, is threat intelligence, right? Those indicators. Intelligence, again, with intelligence without analysis is at best information, and at worst just data without concept. All right. So let's take back threat intelligence. Your own threat intel that you generate is typically far more useful Not to say, you know, plugging those things into your network security appliances isn't useful, but if you suffer from alert fatigue, like I know that a lot of organizations do, then it may be doing more harm than good, right? So back to the pyramid of pain. The idea here that indicators are so easy to change, right? Signatures, IP addresses, domain names, the sorts of things that we see being dynamic, you know, all the time. It's riffraff. It's something that I should, you know, be paying attention to. But more importantly, it's very, very difficult for an adversary to change those behaviors. Why that's so important is because by analyzing those types of behaviors, I might not care as much about the IP address or the signature of the payload, or even, you know, if it's a potential 0-day. If I'm focusing on the types of behaviors that would be associated with potential malicious activity. The ultimate goal is to cross-reference the topology of the network with the vulnerabilities, right, to kind of superimpose the two over the top of one another to determine the likely avenue of approach. Lastly, it's important to understand how these types of attacks take place and the kind of behavioral indicators one can expect from each of them. By doing that and using, you know, everybody's favorite framework, the attack matrix, we can focus on those areas that maybe we're weak in terms of detection, or more importantly, protection. We need to assess essentially whether or not that gap can be closed without impeding usability. And if we can't close that gap, are we able to detect behaviors that may be taking advantage thereof? But you know, in a lot of cases where you come across an organization that says, "Hey, we can't close these gaps, right? We need to keep these things open for legacy foundation reasons or whatever else." Rarely are we seeing any type of cost-benefit analysis, right, to really enumerate what the level of impact could be, you know, versus what it's, you know, why it's important to keep that gap open. So that's difficult to do as a one-off, but if we're doing the legwork up front to generate risk analysis, we can more effectively assess, you know, the correct avenue of approach to maybe going around those vulnerabilities and ultimately closing them. All right, so kind of lending from the pyramid of pain is taking on the approach of a top-down threat-based defense. It's very popular, right, to start with cyber hygiene and say we're going to get to security, right? But starting from the bottom up, this is a little bit, you know, maybe of a different approach. But my point being, if we're focusing on the likely attack vectors, if we're focusing on where those gaps are and then taking the efforts to remediate those gaps, necessarily you get to cyber hygiene, right? And so when we're working sort of backwards from impact, we can mitigate the most glaring and dire issues up front. So, for example, if I came into a specific area and I noticed all the pipes were leaking and everything, yeah, I may need to think about how are we going to reroute everything so that, you know, we have a more efficient system and our pipes aren't leaking everywhere. But obviously, the most critical need right up front is to stop the leak, right? And so we develop kind of a yin and yang, a top-down and bottom-up approach, rather than just focusing on let's build this foundation and do that over the course of months or years. stop the leaks up front, right? And then focus on how can we better engineer things to ensure that these types of problems don't happen again. So the added benefit to this is a lot of times when we approach the academic sort of cyber hygiene approach only, is that when we are really trying to understand our network, understand our impact assessments, understand where the real threats lie, we may be building towards something that isn't necessarily uniquely patterned after how our network operates, right? But when we approach things from sort of the top down and trying to assess what the attacks would be, what the impacts would be, we can get a better idea of how to potentially engineer our network and lay out our approach towards cyber hygiene. So again, it's a process of understanding the best way forward. If you can't see how improving your cyber governance, your asset management is improving your security stature, again, why are we doing it, right? Not to say those things aren't important, they're exceptionally important, but you'll get there. And so an example there would be if I approach it from the top down, right, the attack vectors, maybe initially to understand what would the impacts be, what would a likely attack vector be, I get towards a security foundation, right, to address those gaps, which end up having overlapping foundational controls that pertain to other gaps in coverage. Addressing your security challenges through risk will lead the way to cyber hygiene. For example, if I were to assess for drive-by compromise, if your browsers were sandboxed and you answered, oh yeah, that's part of our policy, that's enforced, my subsequent question might be, okay, do you know all the assets within your network? Do you know every device that's currently attached? If the answer is no, well then effectively your sandbox browser policy is not in effect in a lot of respects. So it lets the security strategists know that, oh, we have a lot more work to do. We need to do a lot more diligence, because I can't really say that that's something that's in place when I don't really have visibility over what's in my network. So you get to cyber hygiene, right? We get to those foundational levels necessarily. So again, it's not necessarily focusing on one over the other, but I think that yin-yang approach of really trying to assess what you're trying to protect is maybe a better strategy. So when we approach our risk management, we really need to understand that threat intelligence needs to play into it, right? It needs to inform what those risks are. So the nice thing is that risk management by a lot of organizations is already something that people use to assess maybe their competition. Executives maybe understand those things already. So when I'm making the case that in terms of real dollars, impact levels, and saying I've quantified our risk, I've put a number to it, I've qualified it, I've quantified it. These are things that we need to assess immediately, and if we do that, I can bring down our risk. This percentage wise, subsequently this many dollar wise, becomes easy, an easy call typically to decide whether I need to accept this risk, mitigate it, transfer it, or eliminate it. So I think this becomes a way to kind of bridge the gap as well between those that are tasked with protecting our network and those that are tasked with securing it. more importantly, in my experience, there's been a lot of issues between the organizations, the IT department, even the security department, and then potentially threat intelligence teams that are meant to go out and collect information and report on it to determine where we need to be spending our time. And I find there's a lot of communication issues even between those teams. You know, the internal guys not really knowing what to ask for, or, you know, going and getting that information themselves as best they can. And then on the other side, threat intelligence teams not necessarily knowing what information to relinquish. I've seen that in a number of cases. So it can lead to a lot of hypotheticals, right? Risk teams basically chasing ghosts and saying, you know, what should we be concerned with? Well, if you've got a common conduit between those two organizations, that information should be coming in, right, to let you know the things that you should be concerned with and how to. It's not just a question of determining what the risks are, but determining how to action those risks, whether it's something that that's acceptable, or it's something we need to prioritize, transfer, eliminate, so on and so forth. So there needs to be that process, right, that can serve as that common, you know, platform. So you know, there's been a lot of different risk rating foundations that have been out there, but I like to use the oh, sorry about that. We like to use the OWASP risk rating methodology as an introductory platform, and the reason why, it's very, very simple, but it's also very, very malleable. It allows people to approach their risk factors in a unique way. So it gives you kind of a foundation, something that you can use on the front end to determine the different factors that play into likelihood and impact. But when I say it's malleable, I mean you can tweak it to yourself, right? You can weight things differently as well. So by going down this route, it gives you that introductory sort of foundation, right? So it's important to understand risk, but again, when we look at something like this, you may be asking yourself, well, what am I assessing, right? I don't necessarily know what kind of event I'm supposed to go in and assess, and that can be an issue. And one of the things that I would recommend is that you utilize the attack framework to go down that road and start looking at that as a template of sorts to determine what are we at risk for all these different techniques, these tactics, and, you know, where are our crown jewels, so on and so forth. So I'll show that here in a moment. So one of the things that I put together a few years ago was to kind of illustrate that relationship between the internal teams and sort of the external threat intelligence team, and put that together in what I call the proactive cyber defense cycle. Really, on the front end, it allows for you know, risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, security scans, things like that, to identify risks and kind of plot that into a common risk profile that then serves as that common conduit for all the people in the organization to understand what things they need to be focusing on. So once that information is put in, it gives sort of the threat intelligence side of the house, even if it's not a different team, just kind of switching gears to go out and employ the intelligence cycle to determine, okay, now that we understand that these vulnerabilities exist, let's use our intelligence methods of going out and collecting the information, of exploiting it, analyzing it, and then subsequently disseminating and reporting our findings into that common risk profile to determine how pervasive the threat is. Okay, so by focusing on things like the ease of exploitation, some of the just to jump back here, you know, the threat agent factors that they talk about in the risk rating methodology, skill level, motive, opportunity, size, and again, you can change those things, but those give you an idea of what are some of the things you need to focus on, right, on the threat side. Once that goes into that common risk profile, now we're able to sort of quantify, you know, how pervasive these issues are, right? Especially if we focus on impact first and kind of work our way backwards, right? That sort of top-down assessment. In doing so, we can then evaluate our risk. This is a common place for us to discuss what our you know, potential evaluation and treatment plan is going to be. Whether or not we need to make meaningful remediations into closing some of these gaps, and what our priorities are, right? And so in the bottom corner is you know, just a dashboard we've built for one of our customers, just an example. It quantifies risk, it quantifies the most likely impact method, and then for each of the individual techniques or tactics within the attack framework, how likely each individual technique is. And so I'll show you how we kind of heat map that out here. All right, so jumping forward here, kind of again lending from our pyramid of pain, focusing on the behaviors, we can get to where we are able to kind of heat map out our navigator, and the visual's great, right? But it's only as good as the analysis underneath, and we're by no means the only ones that would heat map something like this out. I know Cyber War Dog's done a ton of work on this on the detection side. There's been a lot of approaches. What I'm advocating here is, if we are using this as kind of the confluence between assessing you know, our vulnerabilities and then assessing how pervasive an attacker is going to be, those are the areas that are going to show up in red, right? And then you can build multiple layers. So if you go to the attack navigator, and there's a link there as well, you can start to build your scoring model with color coding in this way, but you can also build additional layers, so you can focus on what are just the internal weaknesses, and then you can focus on maybe what are the external threats based on how pervasive they are, how many examples have been given in the past for those types of techniques, or you can focus on one particular adversary if you want, and then basically superimpose the two over one another into one master framework. And in doing so, you start to get those likely avenues of approach, those areas in red, right? Those are the areas where I'm weak, where the adversary is strong. You're able to calculate your risk level by assessing that likelihood. That likelihood, a lot of what goes into that is how pervasive the threat is and how weak you are, right? And then the impact, which is so important, right? This gets me to likelihood, but impact, the nice thing is that in the last year, MITRE added in an impact column as well, an impact technique or tactic. In going through and assessing the likelihood of those impacts, you can also assess how big of an issue would it be if these sorts of things were to happen. And in doing so, you can kind of work backwards to building out those likely attack vectors. So your internal risk assessment can focus on the types of opportunities that are out there, the current vulnerabilities, gaps in protection, your attack surface. I take something kind of lending from a project management process called critical path, right? What would the critical path to gaining your most impactful event, and then work your way backwards from there. Your cyber governance, your ability to detect certain things, those all may go to the risk side. Conversely, on the threat side, how prevalent is the attack? What kind of capabilities are present in a potential adversary? The ease of exploitation, how skillful does an adversary have to be? Any recent activity that we've seen, observed activity, doing that analysis on our scans to say, we've identified a lot of potential issues, a lot of vulnerabilities. Let's look externally and see how pervasive the threats are to those types of vulnerabilities, and then hopefully with a common platform, whether it be a platform that somebody has built like us, or that you could do yourself, or just start with a spreadsheet or some place that you can have that common conversation and enumerate where those likely attack vectors are going to be. So that kind of covers the approach. Feel free to reach out to us or me for any additional information. Other than that, that kind of covers the ins and outs of a threat-based defense model as we see it.
All right, James.
Claps.
Yeah, you're supposed to do like this, Dave. That's the
Oh,
Zoom.
is that how we
Zoom.
do it now? I will get better. I'll get little symbols is what I'll get. So
All right.
cool.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, one thing that always strikes out at me is that in presentations that I've seen of this nature, especially with the triangle of pain, we talk about how it's harder for them to change their behaviors. But when we share information about them, I don't know that there is a format that you can share that is behavior based, unless you're thinking Sigma. And I feel like Sigma's extremely bad.
Yeah,
like, I don't think Sigma's
you're
good.
illustrating something that has been I don't want to call it a complaint. I don't know what else to call it, but the organization, we've definitely tried to work towards this, is those that start to map CVEs constantly to a common repository to attack techniques, I think is gonna make quite the splash, because that is kind of lacking, right? Is we're still so indicator focused, and that's where we get most of our data, but is anybody mapping those things? And I think you're starting to see it a little bit more. Some of the newer threat intelligence platforms that come out, as I think they try to make that distinction between the indicator and the actual technique, but there's still a long way to go on that front for sure.
Cool. All right, Bryson, I believe you have announcements.
Yes, I am going to pull up my screen here.
Thank you so much, James. That was great.
Appreciate it. Thank you.